The word hit her like a fist to the sternum, and Opal Underwood stood there in the middle of the dusty street in Redemption, Texas, holding her carpetbag with both hands so tight that her knuckles had gone the color of bleached bone. The telegram was still crumpled in her coat pocket, the one she had read 14 times on the stagecoach from San Antonio, the one that had said, "Come back if you want, but don't expect a welcome." That was the entirety of the message. No name signed at the bottom. No declaration of anything that resembled warmth. Just those cold, flat words pressed into paper by a telegraph operator who had probably thought nothing of it at all. She had told herself, all the way through the long, rattling miles, that nobody would be waiting. She had told herself this out loud once to the woman sitting across from her in the coach, a heavy-set merchant's wife who had been trying to make pleasant conversation about the weather turning cold. Opal had looked up from the telegram and said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact she was accustomed to carrying. "Nobody waits for me." And then the stagecoach had rolled through the gate of Redemption's main entrance, the wooden arch still standing over the road the way it had stood for the past 12 years, and there he was, John Walker. He was leaning against the gatepost with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed over his chest, one boot propped back against the wood, and he was looking directly at the coach window where she sat. Not searching, not scanning the road, looking directly at her as if he had known exactly which window she would be in, as if he had memorized that too, the way a man memorizes the things he has spent years trying to forget. Opal's breath left her body in a slow, ragged way that had nothing to do with the cold. She had been gone for 3 years. She had left him standing in a different doorway, in a different kind of silence, with a different kind of look on his face. That look had been the kind that a man gets when someone he trusted has just shown him that the trust was misplaced, when the floor drops out from under the story he believed in, and he sees the dark space beneath. She had done that to him. She had known she was doing it, and she had walked away anyway because she had believed, with every fiber of the conviction that had driven her through most of her 26 years, that she had no other choice. That was the secret that had sat between them like a loaded revolver on a supper table, the thing neither of them had ever been brave enough to reach for and unload. His name was John Walker, and she had been in love with him since she was 22 years old, and she had ruined it. She had ruined it in the specific, catastrophic way that only happens when two people have something real, and one of them is carrying a dark past so heavy it bends them toward destruction even when they are trying desperately to do the right thing. The stagecoach stopped. The driver called out the arrival. Opal did not move for a full 10 seconds. Then she picked up her bag and stepped down into the dust of Redemption, and John Walker straightened up from that gatepost and looked at her across 15 feet of October air, and neither of them said a word. It was the merchant's wife who finally broke it, bustling past with her trunks and exclaiming about the cold, and the noise of it jolted Opal back into her body, back into the present, back into the terrifying reality that he was here, he had waited, and she still did not know why. To understand how they had arrived at this impossible, suspended moment, you have to go back to the beginning of it, back to the spring of 1881, when Opal Underwood rode into Redemption the first time, not on a stagecoach, but on a borrowed horse with $40 in her boot, and a last name that meant something dangerous in 3 counties to the south. She had come because the town had advertised for a school teacher in the San Antonio paper. The previous teacher had left in February under circumstances the advertisement described only as personal, which Opal had learned later meant he had lost his nerve after 2 of the cattle rancher's sons put a rattlesnake in his desk drawer. She did not frighten easily. She had grown up in a household where real threats came in human form, and a rattlesnake seemed almost polite by comparison. The man who had hired her was Mayor Horace Bellamy, a round, red-faced politician with the kind of permanent smile that never quite reached his eyes, and he had looked at her references from the school in San Antonio and her certificate from the teaching college in Austin and said, "Fine, fine. You'll start Monday. We pay $30 a month, and you board with the Reeves family on the north end of town." She had shaken his hand and thanked him in the precise, measured way she had learned to be thankful for things without revealing how much she needed them. She had met John Walker on her third day in redemption. She had been crossing the main street with a stack of primer books she had requisitioned from the supply office, and he had come around the corner of the general store on a big roan horse at what she would later classify as an unreasonable speed for a town street, and she had stepped back fast, and the books had gone everywhere. He had pulled up the horse in an instant, dismounted in one smooth motion, and been down on one knee in the dirt picking up primers before she had even processed what had happened. He was 28 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that suggested stubbornness and the kind of eyes that suggested he was watching more than he was saying. He was the sheriff of Redemption County. She found this out because when he handed her the last of the books he stood up and she saw the star on his chest and felt the particular complicated feeling that law enforcement had always given her, the feeling made entirely of her family's history, which was a history of standing on the wrong side of that star. He had asked if she was all right. She had said yes. He had tipped his hat and said, "Welcome to Redemption, miss. I'm John Walker," and she had said Opal Underwood, and something in his face had shifted just the smallest degree at the name. She had noticed. She noticed everything. It was how she had survived. She had asked him that evening, when she encountered him coming out of the sheriff's office, and he had asked politely how she was settling in, whether her last name meant anything to him. She had asked it directly, because she was not capable of the kind of delicate social maneuvering that required her to wait around for a trap to close on her. He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "There was a man named Cal Underwood who ran stolen horses through this county about 4 years back." He said it without accusation, just as information being offered. She had said, "That was my father and he's dead, and I'm not him." John Walker had studied her face for a long moment and then nodded once, in the way of a man who has filed something and moved it to a particular drawer in his mind, and said, "All right then. Good evening, Miss Underwood." She had gone back to the Reeves house and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at the wall and thought, "This is how it starts. This is how a dark past becomes a present-tense problem." She had run from that name, from the legacy of Cal Underwood and the men he rode with and the things he had done, and it had followed her here the way it followed her everywhere, like a shadow with teeth. But John Walker, to his considerable credit, had let it be. He had not gone digging. He had not treated her with suspicion or ice, or the particular kind of contempt that some men reserved for people whose families had broken the law. He had treated her like the schoolteacher she was, which meant he tipped his hat when he saw her on the street and sometimes stopped to talk about the weather or the town council's latest argument about road improvements, and once memorably had asked her opinion on whether the older Bellamy boy, who was one of her students, was as intelligent as his father kept insisting, and she had given him an honest assessment that had made him laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that she had not been expecting, and that had done something immediate and unwelcome to her composure. She had thought about that laugh for 3 days. It was not a secret that required much examination. She was attracted to him in the specific way that made everything more complicated, in the way that made her aware of him across a room and aware of herself being aware of him, which was the most inconvenient kind of awareness a person could have when they were already carrying a secret that could destroy every careful thing they had built. The secret was not just Cal Underwood being a horse thief. That was the surface layer. The real secret, the one she had carried since she was 19 years old, was that her father had not acted alone. He had had a partner in his operation, a man who had planned it and funded it and kept his own hands clean while Cal Underwood took the risks. That man was still alive. That man was still in Texas. And that man had made it very clear to Opal, before she had fled south to San Antonio, that if she ever told anyone what she knew about him, her life would become very short. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he was, as of the spring of 1881, sitting on the Redemption Town Council and styling himself as a prominent citizen and a personal friend of Mayor Horace Bellamy. This was the trap she had walked into without knowing it was a trap. This was the reason that the previous teacher's departure by Rattlesnake seemed, in retrospect, like a warning she should have heeded. She had recognized Marsh the second week she was in Redemption. At a town council meeting, she had attended to request a budget for new textbooks. He had been sitting at the long table in his good coat with his silver pocket watch and his politician's smile, and she had looked at him and felt the specific cold that she associated with extreme danger, the cold that started in the center of the chest and moved outward. She had finished her presentation without any outward sign of what had just happened inside her, because she had had years of practice with that particular performance. That night she had sat in her room and considered leaving. It would have been the reasonable thing to do. Pack the bag, invent an excuse, be gone by morning. But she had been leaving for 3 years. She had been running since the night her father died and Gerald Marsh had come to their door and made his terms clear to her, his voice quiet and reasonable, which was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. She was tired of running. And she had a job, a real job with children who needed teaching, and she had begun to believe, recklessly, that she deserved to stay somewhere for more than a few months before the dark past caught up with her again. She stayed. She was careful around Marsh. She avoided him, avoided the situations where they might be in the same room, avoided giving him any reason to look twice at her. He had only seen her twice before, both times briefly, and she had changed considerably in 3 years. She was not the frightened 19-year-old who had stood in a doorway watching him speak to her father anymore. She was a schoolteacher with a certificate and a posture, and a way of occupying her own space that said nothing of fear if she was working hard enough. She thought he might not recognize her. She thought this for 4 months, right through the summer and into the fall, right through the series of events that constituted her falling entirely, helplessly, and against every rational instinct she possessed, in love with John Walker. It happened in increments, the way falling always does when you are not paying attention to the exact moment of the fall. It happened over conversations that started as small talk about the town and became, gradually, more serious and longer and more honest on both sides. John Walker was not a man who said much, but what he said was always precisely what he meant, and Opal, who had grown up in a house full of deception and half-truth, found this quality almost alarmingly attractive. He was direct without being cruel. He listened in the full way, the way that meant he was actually turning her words over in his mind rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He had been engaged once, she learned, to a woman named Clara Haynes who had ultimately married a banker in Dallas and moved east. He mentioned this without bitterness, which told her something important about his emotional disposition. He said Clara had wanted a different kind of life than the one a sheriff's wife lived, and she had been right to go find it, and he bore her no ill will for it. Opal had thought about this for a long time. She had told him things too, carefully selected things, enough truth to feel like honesty without crossing into the territory of the secret. She told him that her mother had died when she was 10, and that she had grown up in West Texas in a household that did not give much weight to the law, and that she had put herself through the teaching college in Austin on determination, and the money she had made doing laundry and alterations for 2 years before enrollment. He had listened to all of this with the focused attention he brought to everything and had said, that must have taken considerable courage, and she had said, it took considerable stubbornness, and they had both smiled at the distinction. The first time he had touched her hand it had been accidental. October 1881, the harvest social at the Redemption Community Hall. She was carrying a pie she had contributed to the dessert table, and he was opening the hall door from the outside at the same moment. She was reaching for the handle from the inside. And the door swung open, and she lost her balance with the pie and he caught her elbow, and then her hand was in his for about 2 seconds before the pie was stabilized, and they both stepped back, and neither of them said anything about what had just happened in those 2 seconds, which was that the entire trajectory of both their lives had shifted very slightly on its axis. By November, she was letting herself imagine, briefly and then less briefly, what it would mean to build something here, to stay, to be the person she had been pretending to be long enough that the pretending became the truth. She had seen how he looked at her when he thought she was not looking, and she knew what that look meant, and she carried the knowledge of it around with her like a small, warm, terribly fragile thing. And then Gerald Marsh recognized her. She knew the moment it happened. She was leaving the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon in November, locking the door, and she turned and he was on the opposite side of the street, and he was looking at her with the still, measuring look of a man who has just placed a face he had been uncertain about, and she saw the recognition settle into his eyes, and she felt the cold start in the center of her chest again. She walked home at a steady pace and did not look back. He sent a boy to the Reeves house that evening with a note. The note said only, "I know who you are. Meet me at the church Saturday morning. Come alone." This was the trap announcing itself, she thought. This was the moment she had been waiting for since the day she recognized him. She did not go to the church Saturday morning. Instead, early Saturday, before the town was awake, she went to the sheriff's office. John was there, as she had known he would be. He came in early every day. She had learned his patterns. She had been learning them for months the way you learn the patterns of things you are afraid to lose. He looked up when she came in, and she could see him calibrate the expression on her face and understand immediately that this was not a routine visit. She sat down in the chair across from his desk and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that what I'm about to say is going to change how you see me. And I'm telling you anyway because I believe it's the right thing to do, and also because I think you may be the only person in this town who can help me." He had set down his pen and given her his full attention and said, "All right." She told him everything. She told him about Opal Underwood and the horse theft operation and the scale of it, which was larger than the county records reflected, because most of it had been kept off the books. She told him about Gerald Marsh, about his role as the silent architect of the whole enterprise, about the night her father died and Marsh had come to explain to her what would happen if she chose to speak. She told him about San Antonio and the years of running and the teaching certificate she had earned on her own, and the fact that she had come to redemption not knowing Marsh was here. When she finished, John Walker sat in silence for a moment that lasted long enough to feel significant. Then he said, "How long have you known he was here?" She said, 4 months. Something moved across his face then. It was not anger exactly, but it was something close to it on one side and something close to hurt on the other, and she understood that it was the realization of what her 4 months of silence meant, which was that she had known this man was in his town, a man connected to a criminal operation in his county, and she had not told him. She said, "I know I should have told you sooner. I was afraid." He said, "Afraid of Marsh." She said, "Afraid of what you would think of me." That silence again, shorter this time. Then he said, "Have you been honest with me about everything else?" She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment and she watched him decide something, watched him turn the decision over in that careful, methodical way he had, and then he said, "All right. I'm going to need a few days to look into this. In the meantime, I need you to behave exactly as normal. Don't go to that meeting with Marsh. Don't avoid him in a way that tips him off. Just be the school teacher. Can you do that?" She said she could, and she meant it because she had been performing normalcy under pressure for years. What followed was 10 days of very careful, very dangerous work, most of which happened outside Opal's sight but whose edges she could feel in the way John's face changed when she passed him on the street, the way his jaw set tighter, the way the Marsh family's 2 hired men seemed to be watching certain parts of town more closely. On the 10th day, Gerald Marsh was arrested. John had built the case quietly and quickly, calling in a territorial marshal from Austin, gathering testimony from 2 former ranch hands who had been part of the operation, and who were willing to talk in exchange for reduced charges. And most critically, locating the financial records that Marsh had believed destroyed, and which had, in fact, been stored by Cal Underwood in a strongbox with a San Antonio lawyer under instructions to deliver them to the proper authorities in the event of his death. The lawyer, it turned out, had been waiting for someone with sufficient standing to approach him, and John Walker had ridden to San Antonio and back in 4 days to secure them. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. Gerald Marsh was taken from his house in handcuffs and marched through the main street of Redemption while half the town watched from their doorways, and Opal stood on the schoolhouse steps and watched him go, and she felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in 3 years. She had thought that was the beginning of something. She had been wrong about the sequence. Because the thing she had not accounted for, the element of her dark past she had not fully reckoned with, was that Gerald Marsh's arrest meant a public trial, which meant that her name and her father's name would come out, which meant that Redemption would know who she was and where she came from. She had told John this privately. She had not thought about what it would mean in the wider sense. Horace Bellamy, whose friendship with Marsh ran deep in the profitable direction, had moved fast. By Wednesday morning, there was a petition circulating the town to remove Opal Underwood from her position as schoolteacher on the grounds of her family's criminal background. By Thursday afternoon, there was a meeting at the community hall that she was not invited to. By Friday morning, the mayor had come to the Reeves house and told her that the town council had voted to terminate her employment. She had sat very still while Bellamy talked. She had looked at the faded wallpaper in the Reeves parlor and let him finish, and then she had said, "Did Sheriff Walker vote on this?" And Bellamy had said, "The sheriff doesn't sit on the town council, Miss Underwood. This is a civic matter." She went to John that afternoon. He was in his office, and when she came in she could see that he already knew, had probably been dealing with the aftermath of it since morning. His face was set in the way she associated with him being furious about something he could not immediately fix. She told him she had been dismissed. He said he knew. He said he had told Bellamy it was a fool's decision and unjust, and that she had done nothing wrong, that she had been the victim of her father's choices and then of Marsh's threats. He said this with a direct anger that she had never heard from him before, and the force of it moved through her in a way that made her have to look away from his face briefly to keep herself composed. Then he said something she had not expected. He said, "Opal, I know the timing of this is wrong, and I know you have enough to contend with right now, but I need to say this, so I'm going to say it plainly. I've been in love with you since about October, and I don't see any reason to pretend I haven't been. I think you know this. And I want you to know that what's happening with Bellamy and the council has nothing to do with how I see you. I see you clearly. I have from the start. And I would very much like it if you would consider staying in Redemption, even without the teaching position, and giving me the opportunity to show you what that could mean." She had stood in front of his desk and felt the warmth of those words wash over her, and felt, at the same time, the full crushing weight of everything that was about to follow, because she could see the shape of it already, the shape of what was coming, and it was not the shape of the story she wanted to be living in. She said, "I appreciate that more than I can tell you. I do." She heard herself say it, heard the but coming before she had finished constructing it, and she watched his face hear it too. She said, "I think you deserve to know that I feel the same way. I do. But I'm not going to drag what's left of my reputation through this trial and then stay here in a town that has just told me I'm not welcome and make your life harder in the process. You are this town's sheriff. Your credibility matters. Your ability to do your job matters. If you're publicly attached to Cal Underwood's daughter while Marsh's trial is dragging on, the men who supported Marsh will use it against you. You know they will." He had said, "I can handle what people say." She had said, "I know you can, but I'm not willing to let you have to." He had said, "That's not your decision to make." She had said, "John, I know it's not, but I'm asking you to let me make it anyway." She had picked up her bag, which she had already packed. She had been packing it in her mind since Thursday, and she had walked out of his office. He had not tried to stop her physically. He had called her name once, and she had not turned around, because if she had turned around she would have stayed, and she believed then that staying would mean her ruin and eventually his. She had left Redemption on the morning stage, and she had gone back to San Antonio, and she had tried to rebuild for the third time, and it had been the hardest rebuilding she had ever done, because this time what she was building away from was not fear but love. 3 years. 3 years of a new school in San Antonio, a new set of children, a new set of careful patterns and quiet routines. 3 years of not writing to him, though she thought about writing more times than she could count. 3 years of telling herself she had done the right thing, the noble thing, the thing that protected him, and sometimes believing it and sometimes, in the middle of the night, knowing it for the cowardice it partly was. She heard, through the indirect channels of people who move between towns and carry news, the way wind carries seed, that the trial of Gerald Marsh had concluded with a conviction. She heard that Horace Bellamy had been quietly investigated for his own financial connections to Marsh's operation and had resigned from the mayorship. She heard that Redemption had a new mayor, a fair-minded woman named Dorothea Crane, which surprised her pleasantly and gave her the particular feeling of something being set right in a place she had loved. She did not hear anything about John Walker, specifically, for almost 2 years, and then she received the telegram. It had come to her at the school in San Antonio on a Monday morning in October 1884, and the operator who delivered it had handed it over with the blank face of a man who processes 100 messages a week and reads meaning into none of them. She had opened it in the schoolroom before the children arrived and read it, and then read it again. Come back if you want, but don't expect a welcome. No name. She had known the handwriting, or rather she had known the deliberate blankness of it, the way a man who is not sure of his welcome makes his invitation deniable. She had sat with it for a week. Then she had given notice at the San Antonio school, packed her 2 bags, and gotten on the stage. And now here she was, standing in the dust of Redemption's Main Street in October 1884, 3 years older and 10 years wiser, and John Walker was pushing himself off that gatepost and walking toward her across the dirt, and her heart was conducting itself in a way that she would have found undignified if she had had any room left for dignity. He stopped 2 feet from her. This was a respectful distance, a distance that made room for her to set the terms of this encounter. He said, "You came." She said, "I came." He said, "I wasn't sure you would." She said, "I wasn't sure either." He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, the way that took in everything at once without rushing any of it, and she thought she could see 3 years' worth of things in that look, 3 years of his own version of this story that she did not yet know. He said, "I have a lot to tell you." She said, "I have a lot to tell you too." He said, "Are you hungry? There's a proper restaurant on the east side now. Mrs. Ockhaffer and her husband opened it last year, best beef stew in the county." She almost laughed. She had been standing in the ruins of 3 years of complicated feeling, and the first substantive thing he said was about beef stew. But that was John Walker, she remembered. That was exactly John Walker. He dealt with enormous emotional weight by finding the most immediate and practical thread and pulling it. She said, "Yes, I'm hungry." He picked up her carpetbag before she could protest, and they walked together down the main street of Redemption in the October afternoon light, and she noticed the changes the town had acquired in 3 years. A new hardware store, a wider plank sidewalk on the east side, a printing office that had not been there before, and everywhere the particular feeling of a town that had survived something and come out the other side of it with more confidence than before. She noticed people noticing them. A woman hanging laundry paused and looked. The man who ran the general store appeared in his doorway for a moment before retreating. These were the people who had signed the petition, she supposed. Some of them. Others had probably thought it unjust and said nothing, which was its own kind of failure. She kept her chin level and her stride even. The restaurant was warm and smelled of good cooking, and the proprietress, A formidable woman in her 40s named Constance Acaffer greeted John by name and looked at Opal with frank assessment before nodding in a way that seemed to convey both approval and a great deal more awareness of the situation than Opal had expected. They sat at a corner table and the food came, and for a while they talked about the peripheral things, the trial, the new mayor, the way the town had reorganized itself around the vacuum left by Marsh and Bellamy. John told her that Dorothea Crane had been, in fact, exactly the mayor redemption needed, practical and fair, and completely unwilling to be managed by anyone. He said this with a kind of respect that she liked. He told her that 3 of her former students had kept on with their education after she left, which the replacement teacher had apparently found remarkable enough to mention. She said, "You kept track of my students." He said, "I kept track of a few things." They looked at each other across the table. She said, "Why did you send the telegram?" He said, "Because I got tired of waiting for something to shift on its own, and I decided that a man who calls himself practical ought to actually practice the thing." He turned his coffee cup on the table and looked at it instead of her for a moment. He said, "I should have gone to San Antonio myself. I thought about it, more times than I should probably admit to. But I kept thinking she left because she made a choice, and if I go there and upend that choice without her asking me to, then I'm not respecting it. And I respect you. I've always respected you, so I waited." She said 3 years is a long time to wait. He said, "You told me nobody was waiting for you." She stared at him. He looked back at her with the steady, direct gaze of a man who has just laid something very important on the table and is waiting for her to pick it up or leave it. She said, "That's what I told a woman on the stagecoach." "I didn't tell you that." He said, "No, I know, but I think you believed it." She did not immediately respond to that because it was accurate, and because accurate things said about the self in that tone of voice required a moment to absorb. She said, finally, "I believed it because it has always been true before." He said, "I know. And I figured the only useful thing I could do about it was make it not true." Outside the restaurant window, the October sky had gone the deep, saturated blue that preceded dark in the Texas hill country, and the lamps were being lit along the street, one by one, and the town was settling into its evening rhythms. And Opal Underwood sat across from John Walker and felt something she had not felt in 3 years, something she had been very careful not to let herself feel, because it had seemed like a luxury she could not afford. She felt safe. Not entirely, not yet, but in the preliminary way, the first breath after running way, the way that came before trust had been fully reconstructed. She said, "I owe you an apology." He said, "You don't owe me anything." She said, "I do, actually. I made a decision for you, and I told you yourself that it wasn't my decision to make, and I made it anyway, and I've been telling myself it was the noble thing, and I think partly it was, but I think partly it was also that I didn't believe I was worth the trouble. And that was the cowardly part. And I'm sorry for it." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him taking that in. Then he said, "I appreciate that, I do. I won't pretend those 3 years were easy, they weren't. But I also understand what you were carrying, and I understand why you made the choice you made, and I want you to know that I'm not sitting here with 3 years of grievance. I'm sitting here because I want to know what comes next." She said, "What do you want to come next?" He said, "I want you to stay. I want to court you properly if you're willing to be courted. I want to do this in the right order this time, without the shadow of Marsh and Bellamy hanging over everything, without you worrying about what it costs me. The trial is done. The guilty parties are in prison. The new mayor has made it publicly clear that the dismissal of the previous schoolteacher was unjust and politically motivated, and there is currently an open position at the school because your replacement left in August to get married in Kansas." He paused. "I may have noticed the timing of that opening." She said, "John Walker, did you write me a telegram because the teaching position opened up?" He said, "I wrote you a telegram because I have been in love with you for 3 years, and I was tired of being a man who didn't act on the things he felt. and the teaching position opening up was what I decided to call a sign. Opal looked at him for a long moment, this man who had waited at the gate for her return, who had kept faith with something she had not had the courage to keep herself, and she felt the last of the careful distance she had been maintaining dissolve in the way of things that have only been held together by effort, and are released when the effort is finally let go. She said, "I would like very much to be courted by you." Something in his face shifted into something warmer and less defended than she had ever seen from him, and she thought, there it is. There is the version of him that exists when he is not holding himself together against the possibility of loss. He said, "Then I'd say that's a good start." The first weeks of Opal's return to redemption were not without their difficulties. There were people in town who received her back with warmth, Mrs. Reeves, who had never believed the petition was right, and Constance Ockhaffer, who turned out to have opinions about most things and to express them directly, and the 3 students whose continued education John had mentioned, who were now 16, 17, and 18, and who came to her on her second day back to say they were glad she had returned, in the earnest, slightly formal way of young people who mean something deeply, but have not yet learned to say it with ease. There were also people who crossed the street when they saw her coming, which was painful in the particular way of being reminded that the world does not reorganize itself around your personal resolution, that the wounds you carry are not the only ones that have to heal. But the new mayor, Dorothea Crane, had been true to what John had described. She was a tall, thin woman of 50 with iron-gray hair, and the kind of posture that came from decades of refusing to be physically diminished by people who wanted to diminish her. And she had come to the school on Opal's first day back, walked into the classroom while the children were at lunch, looked around and said, "I want you to know that what was done to you in 1881 was an injustice, and this town's council was wrong. I cannot undo it, but I can tell you it will not happen again on my watch." She had said this the way she apparently said most things, plainly and without ceremony, and had then asked Opal her thoughts on the school's reading curriculum, and they had talked for an hour, and Opal had left the conversation feeling that she had found, unexpectedly, an ally. The courtship John had promised was conducted with the deliberate attention he brought to everything he committed to. He came to the schoolhouse at the end of the day on Tuesdays and Thursdays with some pretext that they both understood was not the real purpose, a question about a student's family situation, a notice from the town council about the calendar. They would talk, leaning against the schoolhouse fence or sitting on the steps, until the light started to go. On Saturdays, he sometimes proposed a ride out to the eastern edge of the county, where the land opened up into the long, rolling grassland that Opal had loved from her first week in redemption, and they would ride out and tie the horses and walk and talk for 2 or 3 hours, and the conversations ranged across everything: his family in New Mexico, his years of law enforcement work before redemption, the books she was reading, the letter she had recently written to the teaching college in Austin, proposing a curriculum revision that she had opinions about. He told her about the years after she left, not with accusation but with honesty. He had thrown himself into the Marsh case in a way that went beyond his professional obligation, which he recognized now had been partly a way of staying occupied and partly a way of continuing to do something that was connected to her. When the trial ended and the verdict came in, he had felt a satisfaction that lasted about a day and a half before the emptiness of it closed back in. He had, he admitted, considered going to San Antonio twice, once 8 months after she left and once about a year later. He had talked himself out of it both times with the respect argument, but he acknowledged that there had been moments when the respect argument had felt more like an excuse than a reason. She told him about San Antonio, about the new school and the new children and the particular loneliness of rebuilding in a place that had no memory of you, because redemption, for all its difficulties, had been a place where people knew her name, where the butcher's wife said good morning and meant it, where the routine of daily life had the texture of belonging. San Antonio had been efficient and instructive, and mostly without warmth. She had made one friend there, a woman named Beatrice who ran a millinery shop and who had an irreverent sense of humor and who had told Opal, on the day Opal gave notice at the school, that she thought she was being very stupid and very brave in equal measure, and that she hoped whatever she was going back to was worth the risk. Opal told John this story and he said, "What did you tell her?" Opal said, "I told her I didn't know yet." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I'm beginning to think Beatrice was right about the brave part." It was November, 6 weeks after her return, when he kissed her for the first time. They were standing on the east porch of the Reeves house where she was again boarding, and she had just told him something that had made him laugh, the real, unguarded laugh she remembered. And when the laugh faded, he had looked at her in the lamplight from the parlor window and said, "May I?" And she said yes before she had processed that she was speaking. And then his hand was at her jaw, careful as anything. And the kiss was brief and entirely unhurried, which was, she would think later, exactly right for two people who had already waited 3 years. They were both 30 by this point, him 31 and her 30, and they both brought to it the particular gravity of people who have had enough time to understand what they want and enough experience to know when they have found it. December was remarkable in that it was the month Opal admitted to herself, without qualification or protective disclaimer, that she intended to spend the rest of her life with this man. She did not say this to him yet. She held it and examined it and determined that it was true all the way through, not the surface kind of true that comes from wanting something, but the deep kind that comes from knowing a person thoroughly enough that the knowledge itself is what you love rather than only what you hope they might be. He proposed in January, on a cold evening in the Reeves parlor, in front of Mrs. Reeves, who had engineered the situation by pretending to have an errand and leaving them alone with the fire, which Opal suspected, and Mrs. Reeves later confirmed with no sign of regret. He had a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a simple band with a small turquoise stone set in silver, which she thought was the most beautiful thing she had seen in the category of jewelry in her entire life. He said, "Opal Underwood, you are the most honest, most determined, most inconveniently brave person I have encountered in 31 years of being alive, and I would consider it the best fortune of my life if you would agree to be my wife." She said yes. She said it clearly and immediately, without the pause she might have expected from herself, because there was nothing to pause for, no lingering doubt, no reservation she had not already examined and found to be without foundation. Mrs. Reeves, from behind the closed kitchen door, made a sound that suggested she had been listening and was pleased. They were married in March of 1885, at the Redemption Community Hall, which had been decorated by what seemed like half the town, because by now the narrative of John Walker and the schoolteacher who had come back had taken on the quality of local legend, and people who had been indifferent or hostile 3 years ago had revised their position in the way that people do when the passage of time makes a certain kind of meanness look embarrassing. Mayor Crane officiated, which she had offered to do, and they had both accepted with genuine pleasure. Constance Ockaffer provided the food, refusing any suggestion of payment, which she said was her wedding gift, and the matter was not open for discussion. Opal had written to Beatrice in San Antonio, and Beatrice had come on the stage, wearing an extraordinary hat, and had looked at John Walker and said to Opal, "Yes, I see what you mean," with an expression of approving understanding that made Opal laugh. The ceremony was simple and direct and true, which was the only kind of ceremony either of them wanted. When the words were said and the ring was on her finger, and John looked at her with the full, unguarded warmth she had first glimpsed in November, Opal Underwood, who was becoming Opal Walker, felt the last remaining thread of the person she had been before, the frightened woman who ran, release itself from her hands. She did not need to hold onto that person anymore. She had walked away from her in a sheriff's office doorway in 1881, and spent 3 years trying to reconcile the loss. And here, finally, in the March light of the Redemption Community Hall, with the smell of Constance Acaffer's cooking and the sound of the fiddle player starting up in the corner, she understood that she had not been mourning the woman she lost, but building the woman she was. The years that followed were years of genuine, daily, sometimes difficult, always rooted happiness. They made a home on the north edge of Redemption, a house that John had begun building 18 months before her return, a fact he had admitted to her in December with the slightly sheepish quality of a man, revealing that his certainty had preceded his opportunity by a significant margin. She had looked at him when he told her and said, "You started building a house before you even sent the telegram." And he had said, "I started building a house before I talked myself out of going to San Antonio the second time." She had not had anything to say to that, because it made the back of her throat tight in the particular way of things that are almost too good to look at directly. The house was solid and well made, and over the first year she made it into a home in the way that requires attention and care, and a clear sense of what you want the daily texture of your life to feel like. She planted a kitchen garden and a rose cutting she had managed to obtain from Constance Acaffer's prolific rosebush. She put bookshelves along the parlor wall and filled them slowly, buying books from the Austen catalog and trading recommendations with Dorothea Crane, who turned out to share her interest in history and to own a remarkable collection of books about the indigenous peoples of the Southwest, which expanded Opal's understanding of the land she lived on considerably. She continued teaching. This had been a point that required no discussion, because John had never had any intention of suggesting she stop. He understood her work to be as essential to her as his was to him, which was one of the things she loved most clearly about him. In the spring of 1885, with Mayor Crane's backing and the support of 3 of the larger ranching families who had decided that better-educated children were in their long-term interest, she succeeded in obtaining funding for a second schoolroom and an additional teacher, a young man named Edward Pratt who had graduated from the Austin College the previous year, and who turned out to be excellent at mathematics and terrible at managing classroom noise, which she helped him with over the course of his first semester until he found his authority. The question of children had existed between them in the comfortable way of questions that are not urgent, and they had spoken of it without pressure, and with the shared understanding that they both wanted children and were not in a rush. In the fall of 1885, Opal realized she was expecting, and she told John on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen while he was helping her put up the last of the autumn preserves, and the look on his face was one she kept in the permanent, most carefully maintained part of her memory for the rest of her life. Their son was born in June of 1886, on a warm afternoon when the roses were in bloom in the garden and the whole north side of Redemption smelled of them. They named him Thomas after John's father, with Opal's middle name, which was Clare, offered as a possibility for a middle name and accepted immediately. Thomas Clare Walker arrived in the world with a considerable amount of determination and a voice like a cattle auctioneer. And John Walker, who had faced down outlaws and criminal conspiracies and 3 years of loneliness without losing his composure, held his son for the first time, and Opal saw his eyes go bright with something that was not quite crying, but was its immediate neighbor. Thomas was an energetic and opinionated child who walked early and talked even earlier, and had opinions about the horses before he could reliably hold a fork. He was deeply fond of his father and deeply fascinated by his mother's schoolroom, which she allowed him to sit in on certain afternoons from the age of 3, where he watched the older children write their letters with an attention that the actual students did not always manage. In 1888, when Thomas was 2, their second child arrived, a daughter this time, whom they named Eleanor, for no particular historical reason, except that they both felt that it was exactly her name the moment they saw her. Eleanor was calmer than her brother and possessed of a steady, observational gaze that reminded everyone who saw her of her father, though she had Opal's stubbornness in complete and undiluted form, which became apparent by the time she was 18 months old and absolutely certain about what she did and did not want to eat. These years had their difficulties. Law enforcement on the frontier did not become safe simply because you loved the man who practiced it. There were nights when John came home later than expected, and the hour between his expected arrival and his actual arrival was an hour Opal spent in the particular held-breath state of a woman who has learned not to assume the worst, but cannot quite prevent herself from imagining it. There was a bad winter in 1887, when a series of cattle rustlings in the eastern part of the county led to a confrontation that ended with John taking a grazing wound to the shoulder that was, in the medical assessment of Doc Fernandez, not serious, but which was nonetheless a bullet wound, and which took 6 weeks to fully heal, and during which Opal displayed a combination of excellent practical nursing and barely contained fury at the universe that John found deeply endearing and wisely did not say so until he was fully recovered. There was also the matter of Cal Underwood's name, which surfaced periodically in the conversations of people who were not kind or were simply careless, and which Opal had learned to manage with a composure that came from having genuinely made peace with her origin rather than simply suppressed it. She was Cal Underwood's daughter. He had been a flawed man who had made choices that damaged other people and ultimately himself. She had not made those choices. She had made her own. The line between those two truths was clear to her, and she had drawn it, and she stood on the right side of it, and that was what mattered. John had once, early in their marriage, overheard someone at the feed store make a remark about it that was intended to be heard by him, a subtle, testing kind of cruelty, and he had turned around and said, with complete calm, that he was sure the speaker was not suggesting that a woman was responsible for her father's crimes, because that would be an ignorant position to hold, and he did not associate himself with ignorant positions. And the man had looked at the sheriff's star and said nothing. And John had bought his feed and walked out and told Opal about it that evening, and she had looked at him and thought, "There is the man I chose, right there," and felt the warmth of having chosen correctly. By 1889, Redemption had grown enough to have 2 churches, a new bank, a telegraph office independent of the general store, and a small newspaper called the Redemption Courier that Dorothea Crane had helped fund, and that had the distinction of being one of the few frontier papers willing to print editorials about indigenous land rights, which made it unpopular with certain ranching interests, and essential to Opal's sense of the town's moral character. John was re-elected sheriff 3 times during this period, each time without significant opposition, because he had built in Redemption the reputation that came from being consistently fair, consistently honest, and consistently present at the moments when presence mattered. He was the kind of lawman who was remembered not for dramatic confrontations, but for the 100 small decisions that added up to a community believing it was protected and respected in equal measure. In the fall of 1889, Opal accepted an invitation from the Austin Teaching College to deliver a lecture on frontier education, specifically on the challenges and innovations of teaching in small, underfunded schools with mixed ages and limited resources. She was nervous about it in the week before she went, more nervous than she had expected to be, and John sat with her the evening before her departure and listened to her practice the opening argument and said, without flattery, that it was excellent and she should say it exactly that way. She went to Austin on the stage, which took 2 days, and delivered the lecture to an audience of 43 students and faculty members who received it with considerable attention, and she was invited on the spot to submit a written version for the college's publication, which she spent the following month writing, and which was published in the spring of 1890, the first time her name had appeared in print in a professional capacity, and which she kept a copy of in the top drawer of the writing desk in the parlor for the rest of her life. In 1891, When Thomas was 5 and Eleanor was 3, their third child arrived, another son, whom they named Samuel. Samuel was born with a quiet cheerfulness that seemed almost implausible given the combined personality traits of his parents, both of whom tended toward intensity. He was the child who fell asleep easiest and ate without complaint, and could be placed in a room with any combination of people and be comfortable. And John said, when Samuel was about 6 months old, that he thought the boy was going to be either the most beloved person in whatever community he found himself in or the town's best poker player, and possibly both. The household of 3 children was a full, loud, warm household that Opal had not, in her most private imagination, known she was capable of deserving. She thought about this sometimes, in the quiet moments that a mother of 3 small children could count on one hand per week, thought about the 19-year-old who had stood in a doorway listening to Gerald Marsh make his threats, and believed, with every available evidence to support the belief, that she was a person to whom good things did not accrue. She tried, occasionally, to explain to that 19-year-old something about the future, and she thought the 19-year-old would not believe her, which was its own kind of understanding. John turned 40 in 1893. Opal organized, with the considerable assistance of Constance Acaffer and the willing conspiracy of Dorothea Crane, and 3 other women who had become her real, permanent friends in the years since her return, a birthday gathering that was nominally a dinner party, and was actually most of redemption coming through the front door of the Walker house over the course of an evening, bringing food and expressing general goodwill in the direct, unceremonious way of Western Texas people who did not see the point of excessive formality. John, who had not suspected anything, stood at the door of his own home for the third arrival and looked at Opal with an expression of such clear and undefended happiness that she had to press her lips together briefly to keep her own composure. Thomas, who was 7 and had clearly inherited his mother's tendency to notice things and file them away, came to stand next to Opal at one point during the evening and looked at his father across the room, who was deep in conversation with the new deputy and old Doc Fernandez, and said, "Papa looks happy." Opal looked at her son and said, "Yes, he does." Thomas said, "He always looks happy when we're all here." And Opal said, "Yes, he does." And this time she did not entirely maintain her composure, though she recovered before Thomas could investigate further. In the winter of 1893, a cold and difficult winter that hit the cattle ranches hard and put many of Redemption's families under financial strain, Opal organized the school into a distribution center for donated goods and coordinated with the new reverend at the Methodist Church to ensure that no family in the school's reach went without food through the worst months. This effort was not frictionless. It required negotiation and persuasion, and more than one conversation where she felt the old resistance from certain quarters who believed need was a moral failing rather than a circumstance, and she met this resistance with the particular combination of patience and immovability that she had perfected over the years. John helped where he could, which was considerably, because the sheriff's office had relationships and leverage that a schoolteacher did not, and they worked together during those months in the way of 2 people who have built a genuine partnership, the kind where the skills are complementary and the goals are aligned, and neither of them has to pretend to be other than what they are. Spring came and the worst of the hardship passed, and Redemption came through it intact, which Dorothea Crane noted in the Courier in an editorial that praised the community's collective effort and mentioned Opal Walker by name in a way that embarrassed Opal, and that John read aloud at breakfast with considerable satisfaction. Eleanor, at 5, had developed a passionate interest in horses that was approximately equal in intensity to her brother Thomas's interest in machinery, specifically the kind of mechanical devices that John's increasingly regular trips to Austin for law enforcement conferences exposed him to, and which he described on his return in enough detail to give Thomas detailed questions to work through. Samuel, at 2, was content to observe all of this and assist where he could reach. The household existed in a state of productive organized chaos that Opal managed with the same methodical attention she gave to the classroom, and that John supported with the same steady, capable presence he brought to everything. In 1894, Opal's friend Beatrice came to visit from San Antonio, bringing the extraordinary hat tradition with her, and stayed for a month, which was long enough for Beatrice to develop a decided opinion about every member of the Walker household, including the horses, and to declare redemption far more interesting than she had expected, and to admit that she could see why Opal had come back. She and Constance Acaffer became immediate friends, bonded by a shared directness of expression and a lack of patience for circumlocution, and Opal watched the two of them in conversation one afternoon and thought, "I have built a life here, a real one, with real people in it," and the wonder of that had not diminished in the 9 years since she had stood in the October dust at the gate and found John Walker waiting. The gate itself had become a thing between them, a shorthand that needed no explanation. On the hard days and the good days and the ordinary days between, Opal sometimes thought about that image, the man at the gate, the man who had made the words "nobody waits for me" into a lie without making a production of it, who had simply done the thing that disproved the belief and waited for her to arrive and see. She told him this one evening in the autumn of 1894, when the children were asleep and they were sitting on the east porch of the house in the cool of the evening with coffee, and she said, "I think about the gate sometimes." He looked at her and said, "What about it?" She said, "I had told myself nobody would be there, and you were there, and I've been thinking about how that one moment changed the whole story I thought I was living in." He looked at the coffee in his cup for a moment and then said, "I thought about not going. I spent the morning arguing with myself about whether it was the right thing to do or whether I was just—" He paused, making a statement that was really about my own need rather than your benefit. She said, "What decided you?" He said, "I decided that I had been a man who talked himself out of action often enough on this particular subject, and I was going to be different, just for once, just to see what happened." She said, "And?" He said, "And you came back." He looked at her, "And I would do it again." She put her hand over his on the porch rail and they sat in the quiet of the redemption evening, the crickets working in the grass and the lamp in the parlor window warm behind them, and she thought there was nothing that needed to be added to that. In 1895, Thomas turned 9 and was tall for his age, and absolutely set on becoming an engineer, a word he had encountered in one of the Austin publications his father brought back, and that he had attached himself to with the specific determination that indicated a genuine rather than passing interest. Eleanor was 7 and had the best seat of any 7-year-old that even the most experienced redemption horsewomen had seen, a fact that was acknowledged with the slightly grudging admiration of people who had expected to be better than a small girl and found themselves unable to claim it. Samuel was 6 and had, true to John's early prediction, become the child that every other child in the school wanted to sit next to, possessed of a social facility and warmth that was all his own. Opal, that year, with Mayor Crane's support and funding from a state education grant that she had applied for herself, wrote 3 times, and received after the 3rd attempt, opened a second school on the south side of Redemption to serve the children of the Mexican families who had largely been excluded from the main school, which was a situation she had identified in her first year back and had been building toward addressing ever since. This was not without opposition, and the opposition had a specific quality of entitlement that she recognized from other battles, the belief that certain people's education was an optional thing that could be offered or withheld without moral consequence. She met this belief with the methodical, document-supported, unflappable approach she had developed over years, and the school opened in October 1895, staffed by a bilingual teacher named Rosa Garza, who was 23 years old and extremely capable, and who Opal mentored with the same seriousness she would have wanted applied to herself. John attended the opening of the South School. He stood in the back of the room while Opal spoke to the assembled parents and children, and she could see him from the front of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his hat in his hand. And she could see the look on his face, which was the look of a man watching someone he loves doing the thing they were built to do, and it was one of the best things she had ever seen. Their fourth child came in 1897, when Opal was 42 and had not, she admitted privately, expected to be pregnant again, and had a complicated week of feeling about it before the complication resolved into the same pure forward momentum that had always been her response to the significant things. This child was another daughter, whom they named Frances, for no specific historical reason, but because John said it was a strong, clear name and Opal agreed. Frances arrived in a hurry, as if she had been waiting impatiently, and that particular quality of impatience stayed with her. Thomas was 11 by then, Eleanor 9, Samuel 7, and the household reorganized itself around Frances with the flexibility of a family that had some practice with change. Thomas held her with the careful, slightly terrified concentration of a serious child handling something important. Eleanor declared immediately that Frances was hers, meaning her responsibility and her attachment, and proceeded to demonstrate this at every available opportunity for the following years. Samuel simply smiled at her with his usual equanimity, which Frances responded to by sleeping most reliably when he was nearby, a preference that lasted well into her childhood and that everyone found slightly amusing. The late 1890s were years of change for the whole of Texas, the frontier contracting in on itself as the century turned toward its end, the railroad spreading, the open range being fenced, the particular wild quality of the West that had defined a generation becoming something that was already being spoken of in the past tense. John watched these changes with the thoughtful attention of a man who understood that the world he had learned his profession in was becoming something different, and Opal watched him watch the changes and thought about what he was thinking, which was, she was fairly certain, that the things worth preserving were not the lawlessness or the danger but the directness, the self-reliance, the way a community had been required to know itself, and to make its choices explicitly, because there was no ambient structure doing the making for it. He retired as sheriff in 1900 when he was 47. The decision was his own, made carefully, and with the same deliberation he brought to all significant things. He told her beforehand, not as a consultation, but as the sharing of something already determined, because he knew she would have the same opinion and wanted to tell her before telling anyone else. His replacement was a man named Calhoun, 29 years old, already experienced from working with John for 6 years, and John's transition into private life had the quality of a door closing completely on the right thing at the right time. He did not sit still. He became the primary advocate for a program that Mayor Crane had been building for 2 years, a combination of county agricultural improvement and community land trust that was designed to stabilize the small family farms that were being pressured by the larger ranching operations, and which occupied his considerable organizational energy and practical intelligence for most of the next decade. He was good at it. He was good at it because he had spent 20 years learning how a community worked and what it needed, and how to speak to different kinds of people in the language they were most likely to hear. Opal taught at the Redemption School until 1903, when she accepted the position of district school superintendent, overseeing 7 schools including the South School and 2 new ones that had opened in the surrounding area. This was administrative rather than classroom work, which she found less immediately satisfying but more structurally significant, and she brought to it the same long view she had always had about education being the thing that changed not just individual lives, but the conditions under which lives were lived. Thomas, in 1902, left Redemption for Austin to study engineering at the Technical Institute there, which had been his stated goal since he was 9 years old, and his departure was a complicated event for Opal in the way of all first departures, the specific grief of watching the evidence of time pass, though she managed it with better composure than she had expected and had a long letter from Beatrice, who had been told in advance, ready for her on the day after he left, which she had clearly written with the explicit intention of making Opal laugh, and which succeeded. Eleanor, who had continued with the horses, was 17 by 1903 and had already begun working with a ranching family on the west side of the county who had recognized her talent and offered her a position as a trainer, which was unusual for a girl of her age, and which she accepted with the absolute certainty of a person who knows exactly what they are meant to do. John had thoughts about the safety aspects of the work, which he expressed once and then did not press, because he understood his daughter well enough to know that his concern had been heard and registered, and the decision had already been made, and his role now was to support rather than to qualify. In 1905, John and Opal took their first journey away from Redemption together without the children, the first real travel of their married life, a trip to New Mexico to visit John's sister, whom Opal had met twice before, and with whom she had the warm, mutually wary relationship of two people who both loved the same person and understood that the love was their common ground. The journey was 12 days and included 2 days in El Paso that were unexpectedly wonderful, the city having expanded considerably from the frontier outpost it had been, full of people moving in every direction with the specific energy of the early 20th century that was different from anything Opal had known, and she had stood in the middle of it and felt the strange double consciousness of someone who has lived through the transformation of an era, who carries the earlier version in her body and watches the later version with clear eyes. John had stood next to her in the street in El Paso and said, "What are you thinking?" And she had said, "I'm thinking about the difference between who I was when I arrived in Redemption and who I am now." And he had said, she had said, "And I think the difference is bigger than I knew I was growing into." He had looked at her sideways and said, "You have always been exactly who you needed to be." And then he had taken her hand in the middle of the El Paso street, which was not a remarkable thing in 1905, but which still felt to Opal like a small and perfect act of public declaration, and they had continued walking. Samuel, by 1906, was 17 and had developed the predicted social warmth into a genuine vocation for community medicine, having spent 3 years as Doc Fernandez's unofficial and then official assistant, and having decided with the same quiet certainty that characterized all of his decisions that he was going to be a doctor. Doc Fernandez, who was 72 and had been planning his retirement for years without actually executing it, said he was more relieved than he could express, and that Samuel Walker was going to be the best doctor in Redemption's history. And then he continued not retiring for 2 more years because he wanted to finish teaching Samuel everything he knew. Frances, at 9, was already recognizably her mother in the most essential respects, not in face, which was more her father's, but in the way she absorbed information, in the directness of her speech, in the complete absence of any tendency to pretend. She did not notice things that other people might prefer she not notice. She had also developed a talent for drawing that none of the other Walker children had demonstrated, filling the margins of any available paper with detailed observation of the world around her. And Opal, who had always had a respect for talent that went beyond her own capabilities, encouraged this with the same seriousness she applied to everything she believed in. In 1908, Thomas came home from Austin with his engineering certificate and the additional news that he had met a woman there, Clara Reyes, a teacher at the Austin Primary School, whom he brought home in the summer, and who was immediately and thoroughly accepted by every member of the Walker household, including Eleanor's horses, which was considered the most reliable indicator. They were married the following spring, in March 1909, at the Redemption Community Hall, which had been expanded since the original and which looked nothing like the place Opal had been married in 24 years before, and which felt, nonetheless, like the same continuous thing, the same community making the same gesture of celebration and belonging toward one of its own. John danced with Opal at Thomas's wedding in the slow, unpretentious way that people who have been dancing together for a long time have found their rhythm, and she put her forehead briefly against his shoulder and thought about all the distances they had traveled to get to this room, the 3 years of separation, and the decade of careful, daily building, and the 20 years of children and work and friendship, and the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life lived in full. She said quietly into the fabric of his jacket, "Do you remember the gate?" He said, "I remember the gate." She said, "I'm glad you were there." He said, "I was always going to be there." She believed him. Not because she was naive about the contingency of things, but because she had seen the evidence of it. The house he started building before he sent the telegram. The 3 years of waiting while she ran. The 15 feet of October air he had crossed without any guarantee of what she would say, the gate, and the gate post, and the man who leaned against it with his hat pulled low and looked directly at the window he knew she would be in. The century moved forward and the West moved with it, and redemption changed in the ways that all things change, acquiring and losing and transforming, and the Walker family was threaded through the change the way families are when they have put down real roots, present in the new and the old simultaneously, carrying both. Eleanor married in 1912, a rancher named Henry Moss from the western county who was 30 and who had, in Opal's assessment, the primary quality of understanding that her daughter was entirely herself and not in need of modification, which was the most essential thing. They settled on the Moss Ranch, and Eleanor continued her training work with extraordinary success, known across 3 counties by the mid-teens as the best horse trainer in the region, which gave her a satisfaction that was complete in itself. Samuel finished his medical training in San Antonio in 1913, 24 years old and Dr. Walker by designation, and came back to Redemption to take over the practice from Doc Fernandez, who finally, with Samuel's return making it possible, allowed himself to retire. Samuel was everything Doc Fernandez had predicted, thorough and kind, and completely unflappable in the emergencies that a rural practice produced at unpredictable intervals. He married in 1915, a woman named Juanita Garza who was Rosa Garza's younger sister, and whom he had known since she was a student in the South School, and who had grown into a formidable woman with a law degree from the University of Texas and a clear intention to use it. And their partnership was the kind that looked from the outside like 2 separate people going in the same direction, and from the inside like a single force with 2 sources. Frances, the youngest, grew up with the century. She was 22 in 1920 when the 19th Amendment passed, and she had been working toward it since she was 15, writing letters and attending meetings with a tenacity that was entirely her mother's. Opal, who had lived the whole of her adult life in the disenfranchised generation, voted in the 1920 election at 55 years old, and she and Frances went together to the polling place in Redemption, and John came with them and waited outside, and when they came out, he was standing at the door, which she recognized as the specific, deliberate act of echo that it was, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them needed to say anything about it. Frances eventually married late and happily, a journalist named Arthur Beaumont who worked for the Austin paper and who shared her passion for visual art and her stubbornness and her absolute commitment to the truth of things. And they lived in Austin and visited Redemption regularly and always brought the newest photographs, Frances having moved from drawing to photography with the same restless hunger for recording the visible world. In 1925, John Walker turned 72 and Opal 69, and they were still in the house on the north edge of Redemption, the house he had started building before he sent the telegram, though it was considerably larger now and had been added to and repaired and repainted over the decades so that it was the same house and also entirely itself. The rose bush from Constance Ockhafer's cutting, who had died in 1918 at the age of 78, and whose memory Opal kept with the specific, full grief of losing a real friendship, had grown over the years into something that consumed most of the east side of the porch and bloomed every summer in the dark, warm pink of the original. They still sat on that porch in the evenings. They still talked. They had accumulated between them more than 40 years of conversation, and they had not yet run out of things to say, which seemed to Opal to be one of the finest possible outcomes of the whole enterprise. She had spent some of that summer writing, not a curriculum or an administrative report, but a real piece of writing, an account of her years in frontier education for the Texas Historical Record that the Austin Library had solicited through Mayor Crane's successor, a man named James Polly, who had the same practical fairness the position had held since Crane. She wrote it in long evenings while John read beside her, and she included in it the truth of her own arrival in redemption, the dark past she had carried, the circumstances that had led to her original dismissal, the injustice of it, and the years she had spent building something that could not be taken by a single council vote. She wrote it with the directness she had always brought to the significant things. When she was done with the first draft, she read it to John. He listened without interruption through the whole of it, and when she finished, she looked at him over the top of the pages and he said, "It's the truth, and the truth matters, and I think you should send it exactly as it is." She said, "Some people won't like it." He said, "No, some people won't like it," and he said it in the way that meant this was not a relevant consideration. She sent it exactly as it was. Thomas and his Clara had 3 children by now, all grown, and Alina and Henry had 2, and Samuel and Juanita had 4, and Francis and Arthur had 1 and were contemplating a second. The Walker family had produced a small community of its own, connected and various, and Opal and John sat at the center of it with the accumulated weight of 4 decades of having built something real. In the fall of 1925, on an October afternoon that had the particular quality of October afternoons in the Texas Hill Country, the deep blue sky and the turned gold grass, and the smell of something about to change, Opal and John took a ride out to the eastern edge of the county, the way they had ridden in the early months of the courtship, though they went more slowly now and did not tie the horses and walk the same distances they once had. They rode to the top of the long rise that looked out over the rolling grass and stopped and sat on their horses in the cool of the afternoon and looked at the view. John said, "Do you ever think about San Antonio?" She said, "Not the way I used to." He said, "What way is that?" She said, "I used to think about it as the place I went when I was running. Now it's just a place I spent some years." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the grass. Then he said, "What do you think about when you think about your life?" She thought about it seriously, as she took all serious questions. Then she said, "I think about arriving here and not knowing how to stay. I think about learning how." She looked at him. "I think about the gate." He turned to look at her, and he had the same look, the direct, fully present look, the one that had been looking at her across various distances for over 40 years, and she thought it was still the same thing it had always been, not diminished by time or habit but deepened by it, the way a path is deepened by the passage of many years. He said, "I think about the gate too." She said, "What do you think about it?" He said, "I think about standing there arguing with myself about whether to go. And then I think about you coming around the corner on that stagecoach, and I think, there she is, and that is always the last thought before everything else goes quiet." Opal Underwood, who was Opal Walker, who had come from nothing and made something, who had run from fear and returned to love, who had stood in a street in October and heard her own voice say, "Nobody waits for me," and then looked up to find she was wrong, looked at the man beside her in the October light, and felt the full, exact weight of having been loved carefully and well for a very long time, and felt also the full, exact weight of having given the same in return, which was perhaps the greater gift. Because she had started with so little of it to give and had found in the giving that it was not a limited thing. She said, "I'm glad I came back." He said, "I'm glad you came back." The grass moved in the afternoon wind. The sky held its deep October blue. The horses stood quietly on the rise. Below them, to the west, redemption sat in the afternoon light, solid and present and known. They turned the horses and rode home. And at the gate of their own house, the wooden gate in the fence of the kitchen garden, the one John had built the same season as the house, worn smooth by 15 years of hands, Opal dismounted and opened it. And John came through behind her, and she thought about how much a gate could hold, not just as an entrance or an exit, but as the place where the story turned, where the person you had been walking toward the end of one version of yourself met the beginning of another. She had said, "Nobody waits for me." He had been standing at the gate when she returned. Everything that had followed had been the proof of the remaking of that sentence, the long, patient, daily remaking that was what love actually looked like when you got close enough to see it clearly. Not a single dramatic moment, but 10,000 ordinary ones. Each one a small insistence that the story was different from the one she had been telling herself. Each one a gate opening inward. Thomas brought his family to redemption for Christmas that year. Eleanor and Henry came, and Samuel and Juanita with their 4 children, and Francis and Arthur came up from Austin. The house on the north edge of redemption was full in a way that required 2 additional tables and the complete reorganization of the sleeping arrangements, and the noise of it was extraordinary. And in the middle of it John caught Opal's eye across the crowded parlor and did the thing he had done since they were young, the specific look that was just for her, not showy or dramatic, just present and clear, just the look of a man who has found the place he was going and knows it. She held it for a moment. Then Thomas called something from the kitchen, and Eleanor's daughter knocked something off a shelf, and Samuel's youngest started crying, and Francis was trying to tell Arthur something important over the general noise, and the whole magnificent chaos of the life they had built together surged forward and filled every available space. And Opal Walker turned toward it, as she had always turned toward the living thing rather than away from it, and walked into the warmth of her own house, and the gate swung shut behind her. And it was home,